Okay, thank you. So we determined in executive session that there is a third issue with this study that we want to address. In addition to a phase 1 and a phase 2 study.
Madam Chair, can I interrupt just for a second?
Yeah.
Could we also just state on the record that we didn't take any votes during executive session and we didn't take any action during executive session? We just had discussion.
We just had a discussion, an executive executive session, and we are now going to discuss what the third issue is. All right. Do I hear a motion?
Desiree left.
All right, we'll wait, we'll table it till she comes back.
Yeah, she's
Okay.
the one that had written it down so that we had it.
Okay. All right. So,
We can proceed with the other stuff. You want to talk about
the phase 1?
phase 1, 2, sure.
Okay. So with respect to the phase 1 study, what Desiree had indicated before is that this is one where we look at how the connector was striped, was changed in the striping, and whether there's other alternatives, whether we return it to the way it was, keep it the way it is now, or look at some other alternatives in terms of what's the best way to meet the needs of Isle of Palms. According to what I understand now, South Carolina DOT is in the process of hiring their consultant to conduct that study. They have shared with us the scope of work that they have put together. And we are to review it and get back to them with any comments or additions that we want for that scope of work. So Desiree, we're going to go back to what we discussed in executive session at later in the meeting. Okay. We're going to discuss this phase 1 right now, study. All right. Have the two of you read this scope of work for the connector study? Do you have any comments, additions? All right.
No, not really. I mean, it's pretty straightforward here.
Okay.
I would like to, as was mentioned last month, Interim Chief Briscoe brought Mr. Hathaway along with him today. I would like to maybe hear from Hathaway in regards to the subject that we discussed last month about the perceived safety of the connector or not. And so if we could hear from him, I would appreciate that personally.
Okay. I agree.
Okay.
Is there a specific question or?
Well, I mean, if I remember correctly, last month, we called upon Interim Chief Briscoe as well as Chief Cornett to give us their thoughts as to how the restriping of the connector has affected safety, basically. And so Interim Chief Briscoe, of course, didn't have the history on that because he didn't get here until September sometime. So he at that time offered to bring you in because you've been involved in it all along too, just to get your perspective on how you feel the restriping of the connector has either enhanced the traffic situation or adversely affected it. So do you have thoughts on any of that?
I will, and if it's all right, I'm going to go kind of back to the genesis if I could. When this all came about, it was pretty rapid fire, short period of time, not a whole lot of preparation. And to Mr. Hahn's, to Councilmember Hahn's point, it is going to be something that's going to take time to get some of the answers that you really want to get. We're going to need to see over a span of time the different things that occur so that we can make a real educated decision on, something. So just because this season is one way, it doesn't necessarily mean the next one will be the same or anything like that. What I'll tell you is we have a wonderful problem on the Isle of Palms. It's a beautiful island. People want to come here. Traffic is more of a tradition for the Isle of Palms than it is anything else at this point. It's always going to be congested. It's always going to be heavy. So going directly to the topic of the bridge itself, when that was brought forth, the concerns that were shared on behalf of the fire department, to the citizen comments that were earlier, we have no problem with a bike lane or a pedestrian lane or accommodating anybody. Of course, we want everybody to be happy. So the concerns that we had were about the versatility of the way the configuration was before, the ability to have a wide range on one side, a wide range on the other, and then that center median. So all that being said, over this past, since the restriping, we've not had any remarkable changes that would indicate that there's a problem thus far. But again, what it has done is changed the versatility that we had once before by having the options that we did. So some of those have been taken away by the lack of the center median. However, we have not had any remarkable situations where at this point it has really impeded much. What I'll say again, though, to the point of the citizen comments is everything is cause and effect. So, what we do see is, what happens with the connector does affect what happens at other parts of the island. But again, to this point, there's nothing remarkable to which we could say, now that it's been restriped, we're seeing this crazy amount of response time or anything like that. However, what happens tomorrow or next month or next season, there's no way to tell that because, an accident doesn't just always happen right in the center of the lane. So depending on the location of the accident, the time of year, the time of day, all those different, factors are going to affect what that restriping, the effects that it could have on accessibility.
We were provided some data that shows that the number of accidents on the connector doubled for 2021.
Is that Chief Cornett? I think he provided that.
So
Okay.
do you have any, are you aware of that, or do you have any
No,
reason why the accidents would double?
I would let Chief Cornett actually speak to that because their reports are actually going to show cause and those kind of things. For us, it's just about patient care, and those kind of factors. So really, that would be a question that I would defer to Chief Cornett. He would be better able to answer.
Well, one other question for you then in that regard too.
Yes, sir.
So in regards to ingress, egress from the island with emergency vehicles, whether it be, EMS, fire trucks or whatever, you haven't seen a huge delay in any of that. At this point.
Not thus far. No,
Yeah.
nothing remarkable.
Okay, nothing remarkable.
So, and I hope I don't step out of line when I say this, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of Front Beach. We used to have one wide, broad avenue right there. It allowed for us to have all kinds of options when it came to truck placement and being able to get around traffic. So when that median went in, again, it reduced the versatility of, our abilities because of, the lanes being narrowed. And, it's kind of a similar setup here. There hasn't been anything remarkable. I keep stressing that over and over, but it's about the possibility and probability of future events. And those are things that I can't predict. Nobody can.
But before you just barreled straight up the center line and you just didn't.
Well, not always, but depending on the
Yeah.
location of the accident, the severity of
Right.
the accident, the amount
Right.
involved, the time of year, it can cause you to have to take to get creative. Our driver operators have to get creative in how they can access, the accident site or what's going on. So again, we had more options before, whereas now we still have options. We're still going to do our job and do it to the best of our ability, but our options have been minimized because of the current configuration.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Chief Cornett, can you speak to the accident data?
Good morning.
Morning.
This conversation fell at the right time for us because we do an annual review where we pull all of our statistics for the year prior in January. So we were already pulling a lot of this, and we did find some interesting information when we looked at this in regards to stats with the Isle of Palms connector and the island in general. We did see that while overall the island saw a little over 6% decrease in vehicle collisions, there was a rather significant increase in collisions on the Isle of Palms connector. And so what we did was I took every report that we had and I physically went through each one and looked at the causes that were outlined as the primary contributing factor for the collision. And you can see that that's the second graph on the bottom. The majority of them were outlined as distracted or inattention. And some of that could be, it is a beautiful scenery, and we saw that in the past before the changes. Some of that's got to do with that. Some of that is that the traffic in general was not moving at a fast pace, and people not paying attention would run into the back of one another. A lot of those, when you see the primary contributing factor being inattention, the secondary follow-up to that would have been something like following too closely, which happens a lot. Those are your typical types of collisions that we saw dealt with somebody running into the back end of another individual, traffic related collisions like that. And while we were doing it, we did look at response time. Response time is critical for us to look at anyways to see where we fall with the national average for the police department. And I will tell you that what we saw when we looked at the whole thing is it's not a great difference, but there was EMS did have a slight decrease, about 41-second decrease in their response time, while the police and fire department actually saw a little bit of an increase in our response time. That's island-wide though.
Decrease meaning that it was faster?
Correct.
And who saw that? EMS?
EMS saw a faster response time on the island. But with that, the traffic congestion, I believe, played a role in the response time being greater
Mhm.
on the island for police and fire when we look at those things. And those have steadily been increasing, or, the police department dropped significantly in 2020, and then we increased again in 2021. And I'll tell you, that's one of our goals, is to work on decreasing that for 2022. But we did think that was interesting. And if you look on that second page down at the bottom too, I took it a step further. That little line graph you have there specifically outlines EMS response time during the busy times of the year. I base that on when we start to open up our parking, which would be March, and we run that through October. And so when you look at that, you would see that March and April and May, EMS had a decrease. And some of those were pretty significant decrease in their response time. They were faster. But when you get to June, you start to see a relatively significant increase, about 2-minute increase in response time in June for 2021 compared to 2020. And some of that won't necessarily, while this is great information, there are other things that may impact that too, about how EMS is doing their operations. But we do have to look at that part. From June through October, there was an increase in response time for EMS, but overall in the year, they responded faster than they had been.
Those would be the peak traffic volume times as well.
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
And this is island-wide.
That's correct.
Island-wide number,
Yes, sir.
not connected.
Now, EMS is any call they're coming to the island. So they might be coming over the connector, or on rare occasions, they may be coming over Ben Sawyer and coming from Sullivan's Island. Majority of the time, and I think Chief Hathaway would back me up on this, majority of the time, they're coming over the connector. It's a faster response for them to come that way, unless they just happen to have been on Sullivan's Island prior to that. We included police and fire because it is, while EMS response is important, remember your first responders that get there, fire departments trained to render aid and do everything except for transport a patient. That's why we looked at their time. All of our police officers are first aid and CPR certified. So that's why we looked at their response time in relation to this as well.
Okay. So it's all congestion related, basically.
Yes, ma'am. And that would be the consistent response when looking at the collisions too. While you had a couple that were abnormal, like one was a golf cart that should not have been on the connector in the first place, and they just turned too wide and flipped over. It's still a collision, still counts. Another one was inattention, where they weren't paying attention and sideswiped the vehicle that's cleaning the street sweeper. They sideswiped that because they kind of veered off to the right, ran off the road. The majority of them are congestion related, where it's running into the back end of somebody else. And sometimes, if traffic stops quickly, that can be a pretty significant collision that will render vehicles no longer operable, and they have to be towed from the scene. And of course, when that happens, that does tie up the connector for a longer period of time. What we saw last year was we were able to use the bike lane and pedestrian lane to move traffic as much as we could. There were times where we had to just shut it all down until we had something more so that we could safely get those vehicles out. But most of the time, we're able to open it up to allow traffic to pass on one side or the other.
Have we seen an increase in speeding tickets on the connector since the speed limit was changed, or do you have that information handy?
I don't have it in front of me. I will tell you overall, the police department wrote more traffic citations last year compared to years previous. And we did the second highest ticket written did pertain to speeding. I tried to go through and pull all the ones on the connector. But what I pulled was almost 300 tickets in general dealing with the Isle of Palms connector, but that could also be the way they're entered in as a cross street of Palm Boulevard and the connector. So without physically looking at every last one of them,
Right,
which I started to do, but that's a lot.
yeah.
Thank you. That's,
You're welcome.
that's very informative. I'd like to have Jennifer Beal give us her assessment of the phase one. Have you looked at it enough to give us at least a preliminary review of that?
Hi again, everybody. I think what we actually just talked about is something that is not in this phase one, is a kind of a summary of the crash information before the striping was done. And then, I would do 2020. I would, that would be, I'd want to talk to, if that's a good to look at, or if we want to try to do 2021 or even 2022 now, that's maybe last summer is a little bit better. But look at that and then kind of look at the types of basically do a summary similar to what we just heard, but maybe graphically, to be able to see the differences between because they're looking at the safety and all there, but just a little bit, maybe a little bit more detail on that. As a phase one, this is going to be more of a high level study. They're not going to get into the details. It's very connector focused. So it will include the intersection of Palm Boulevard and the connector, but it's not going to include anything else as we move forward. So I think that's just kind of, as long as that's the expectation that we want as part of this first phase. I think that we could maybe ask a couple questions on the existing vehicular volumes and speeds. We want to make sure that they're looking at the time period we're looking at. So I think this could be detailed out a little bit more. And I don't think we want to get into that exactly all the details, and I can get with Desiree on that, but make sure that we're kind of hitting, we want to look at summer versus just existing vehicular volumes. Because if they're looking at a January, February condition for recent volumes, in reality, we really want them to be looking at summer. And while off-season will also be interesting data, because there's not as much traffic kind of coming on and off island. We may want to have them look at both, but we want to make sure that we at least we do want to look at that summer for sure. And that's maybe something for discussion for y'all is, do we want to look at just in season? Do we want to look at off season? Because during off season, there's less traffic, but then there's higher speeds. And so kind of we want that assessment to kind of, even at this high level, be looking at both of those conditions. And that would also carry on to phase two as well.
We really don't have an off season that much anymore.
Right.
I guess this is our low point right now, January, February,
Yeah.
but other than that, we don't see a lot of decrease.
Goes from bad to worse.
But I think overall, this is going to be a very more of a focused, higher level connector focus study.
Okay. How long do you think it should take to do something like this? Would it be pretty quick?
Depending on how many alternatives, and maybe that needs to be out, that's not really specifically outlined. They just said they're going to look at additional alternatives. By the time they get under contract, and I assume they're going to do meetings with the city and all that, it's definitely not a year. I mean, 6 months is, I think, that's probably about, I mean, we might be able to have them shorten that up a little bit. With a very clearly defined scope. But that would be something that, because DOT still got under, was that 6 months from like when they get released from the DOT? So, I mean, that doesn't seem unreasonable, but we would, that's probably about where it'll be for a final report, because in theory, they're going to have a draft report that we're going to review that's going to happen before that. So I think that the intention is that would be full completion at 6 months, and that seems generally reasonable.
Okay. So that does go beyond our season this year. I was trying to think if it was sooner, perhaps we could get it all done without having to ask them to restripe back.
If, I mean, you could challenge them, or we could provide them. I mean, there are some things that you could do initially
Mhm.
that it's gonna, I mean, we're already in February.
Yeah.
So, maybe there is something that they could do. It would be tight, but there might be some things you may be able to do full before the season. But I think for the full study, realistically, it's probably gonna fall like right in summer. But we may be able to talk with Secretary Hall to kind of voice that concern and say, hey, we don't want to wait till next season, two seasons from now. What can we do? And I would challenge the consultant, and I mean, I'm happy to kind of see if there's something that we can adjust from our side as well, but challenge the consultant to say like, okay, well, what can we do before May or whatever that time period is? Because that's a good point, is that this will take you through season probably before you have a 100% finished report. So maybe they could start with the original, just an assessment of the original
Mhm.
and the current, and do that assessment first, and maybe get that done before, if you wanted to look at ask those two alone, and then give them a little bit extra time to do the other alternatives later. I mean, that's an option. I mean, it's more of a timing thing of them looking at, the more options you have, the more alternatives look at, the longer it takes. So, I mean, that could be an option where they're doing those two first.
Mhm.
You get that report before the peak season, and then
That's a good idea.
do the alternatives later.
It's worth an ask, that's for sure. See if they could. Okay, does anyone have any more questions for Jennifer at this point?
No, I really don't. I guess covered it pretty well. I'm good, Chair.
Okay. So I think we'd like to ask Jennifer to make the revisions that she suggested.
Okay.
In the scope, and especially put in that idea that you just proposed with the before and after preliminary evaluation.
Okay, yep, we can do that, and we'll get that to staff.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Do you want to go through the phase 2 scope, or would you rather go back to your question?
I don't care, whatever you want to do. We gotta do it all anyway.
Okay, well, let's do the phase 2 scope next. And I guess, Jennifer, have you had a chance to review that? And just for the public, the phase 2 scope consists of a corridor study of the Isle of Palms connector all the way from US 17 to Palm Boulevard, looking at the traffic flow conditions along there, focusing on signal timing at those intersections, and some possible lane configurations depending upon what we do with the Isle of Palms phase 1 Isle of Palms connector study.
So just a couple, just general comments. Correct, the corridor study would go from US 17 to Palm Boulevard. So we look at the signalized intersections. What I would ask the city is, from some of the information we've heard today, are there any unsignalized intersections we want to also be looking at as potential reconfigurations, making them right in, right out, or prohibiting lefts in, especially as you kind of come on island, maybe expand the study area. I mean, you could study the whole island, but kind of maybe some of those, the ones that were being used, particularly some of the ones that are being used significantly for cut through, is looking at those to see if there's anything that might need to be added. So you might add, say 5 or 10 probably 5,
Mhm.
unsignalized intersections as well. Because as we look at, because it is going to change, if you change the corridor, you're kind of
Yeah.
looking at, you're almost doing a little bit of access management as well to kind of help control where the traffic's going when you do a corridor study. So that would be something, this focus is primarily on the signalized intersections, which are of course important, but there may be some other ones that we have some particular concerns about that we want to try to address.
And this would be the light here at our intersection, but also Rifle Range, Highway
Correct.
17.
Hungry Neck.
In Hungry Neck, so
And
those
Hungry Neck,
4.
right.
Mhm.
I would add on all of that is that, and I guess you would do this anyway, but there is another light, which once you turn on Rifle Range to the left coming off the island, there's another light right there for the entrance of the shopping center.
Mhm.
That might have to be taken into account. And you can go in the other direction, there's a light at 6 Mile, which is, a little ways down there, but still a lot of traffic on Rifle Range. That might be a factor also at sometimes during the high season. And then you have the Hungry Neck extension that will be taking place. And I don't know the timing of that, but they are going to extend Hungry Neck, where the DMV is
Yeah.
going out the other way, which would be a factor in the future, which there's going to be more traffic on that part of Hungry Neck, which might be an impact, but that also could be something that in the long run helps us a bit too, in terms of getting traffic away from the island, basically, once it gets over on the mainland.
Right. And so, all those in Mount Pleasant will also be, we would want to coordinate closely with the town of Mount Pleasant, traffic engineering staff as well. And how those timings how those timings work as
Right.
well. And so I'm not sure how everything is timed today. They're probably, this one is, probably running isolated just because it's by itself. But we would work with Mount Pleasant on those what they have in their system.
This light is controlled by the county. Is that correct? Chief?
Should be. It's state.
SCDOT.
Yeah,
Okay.
it should be
I'm sorry.
state.
Would the study include looking at whether or not roundabout makes more sense than light? on any of
Oh,
these?
sure. So like the alternatives, so typically for a corridor study, we look at widening alternatives, which, in this case is a bridge. I mean, but you could look at, you could look at, that would be an economic component as well. But we typically widening, we look at intersection improvements. And so that can be turn lanes, that can be roundabouts, that can be anything. So if it's something like that, and that's what, anything that and maybe that's this session, or maybe it's a larger session with full council as well, or workshop, that what do we want them to look at? Like they can, any traffic, within our study area is particularly on island, where are concerns? And if I hear the concerns, and I can say like, okay, well, let's, that might be good for a roundabout, or that might be good for this or that. And so we can kind of help develop that alternative, and they'll look at other alternatives as well. But, in a lot of situations like this, then the municipality will have like an alternative that they're going to want to add to the study. That's kind of like your alternative. Like if we had everything we wanted in the world, this is what we would want this to look like. And that would be an alternative that would be studied in the corridor study. So what I think we need to do is make sure that that's one of that's clearly listed in here. And you don't have to have all the details of it right now, but basically that y'all would want to do expand the study area, but then also we have a specific alternative we would like tested, and it'll get compared against the other alternatives. And how the corridor study works, as you look at it, it's not just traffic, it's environmental, it's stormwater, it's utilities, it's cost, and everything's kind of identified for each of the those aspects.
The one thing I think we could add to this that is certainly an issue is the county park is right at the end of the Isle of Palms connector becomes 14th Street past Palm Boulevard. The county park is right off of 14th Street. The way they operate the park, traffic backs up into the intersection of Palm Boulevard and onto the connector because of the way they collect. They bring people into the park.
Mhm.
So it's sort of an interesting conundrum, because the park operation affects traffic And we've been talking with the park about changing the way that they collect funds. Is there something you want to add to that?
No, I was just saying that the mayor and I are meeting and with our chief. We're also meeting with the Mount Pleasant folks and Sullivan's Island next week. And we're also in the process of coordinating a meeting with the county park again to have those discussions. I know that the last year, they weren't able to make any changes to that end, to our
Mhm.
request of them changing their pay to park system. And we want to have that conversation again because they were at the time looking into automated options. So
Okay.
we'll have some more information based on those discussions for the committee at your next meeting.
Yeah, but it's sort of an ancillary issue for any kind of study that's done. The other point is that what we're talking about when we talk about the connector is the majority of it is under the jurisdiction of the town of Mount Pleasant. So they have to be partners with this study. And it may be a way to mollify SCDOT as well, working through Mount Pleasant for that kind of corridor study. It doesn't address our phase one Isle of Palms connector issue, but it does help us because I think the root cause of the whole Isle of Palms connector is traffic congestion. And this is one way to improve traffic flow. And I think we could have some significant changes now because the signal timing, just as y'all have recognized, the signal timing is basically based on volumes in the fall and the spring, which doesn't bother to account for what we do. It also focuses on generally on weekday peaks. Our peak is weekend. So it's interesting. It's complementary in terms of the way we can handle this because Mount Pleasant isn't concerned about our issues. But if our issues will not affect their traffic flow as much as they think. And the issues, some of the issues like their backups on Rifle Range Road on Saturday morning because of traffic backing up coming to the beach. Saturday afternoon, the issue is reversed. So we have some complementary opportunities there, I think, to do some major improvements along that corridor. I think in terms of, we would love to study as much as we can, but in terms of the stakeholders in the meeting, in this kind of study, town of Mount Pleasant's, what is their focus going to be? SCDOT, what are they willing to put in the study? We'll have to look at all of that in terms of the scope. We seem to have made ground with the one that was submitted. And so if you can tighten it up and improve it, then my opinion is I think this will benefit us tremendously in terms of improving traffic flow throughout much of the island, because you'll hear about traffic congestion on Palm Boulevard and Waterway. It's backing up all the way from Rifle Range Road.
Yeah.
So you fix the corridor, you fix a lot of other things as well. I'm anxious to get to phase two almost immediately. That's me. It'll also take longer to do this study. So I agree, a phase one and a phase two is the better way to go about addressing these problems.
And one of the things I think we should ask is, even if they're finishing up phase one, we would like specific data collected this season, this peak season. And
Yeah.
so while they may not be completely finished with phase one, we want to get good. I mean, we do have the count that's on the connector, but for these intersections, we want to get them at their peaks and be able to process that data as part of their peak season. And this looks at a peak season and an off season. So, this is a bigger study, so it'll definitely take longer. But we want to make sure that we don't lose the window for the traffic counts during peak season.
Okay. And what kind of counts do you take? Are they turning movement counts you're talking about rather than ADTs or? Tell us
Yes,
the
so you
difference.
could do, so ADT is, the simplest way we do it is we put down a tube. The one that's on the connector is a station. But if you're doing them elsewhere, you've probably seen where they put one or two tubes across the road, and they will either do volume, and then you can also do, that's just whoever goes over them, just doing volume. It can also do classification and speed if you set them up in a specific way. So other than the locations where DOT has an active hourly station or really daily state, really it's minute by minute, but you would do that if you wanted that kind of information. That just gives you a good idea of like, okay, this is how many people in a day are on this section of road, that section of road. Then the next thing that you do is you look at turning movement counts. And so you've got, usually we look at AM and PM peak hour. With this one, we're gonna do Saturday. We're gonna recommend Saturday, which isn't specifically addressed here. And we'll work with what that timing is, because it's gonna be that turnaround time. We look at this when we did some signal timing down in Hilton Head, and we have those signals kind of going on 278 and on Island have quite a few different plans of, Friday peak, Saturday, Sunday, there's different peaks because they have the same sort of challenges with, people coming on and off Island in kind of bigger chunks. And so they have an evacuation system. It's a bigger signal system, but they've got mandatory voluntary evacuation timings as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of different options that you can do with timings, and some of those may already be in place here, and we can check with the DOT on that. And so, but yes, you would want to do probably turning movement counts at specific times. You're probably always going to do an AM PM weekday because that's just your commuter times. But we want to also focus on at least 1 or 2 times over the weekends that you guys see. And we can look at the connector data to help us with this of what that is. And that's basically through you come to an intersection, who's making a right, who's making a left, who's going through on all the approaches. And it's counted in typically 15-minute periods. And then it's combined, and you come up with what your peak hour is.
Be sure to look at an afternoon thunderstorm.
We can't always do weather. I mean, you do want to get a
I know you don't
typical day.
control the weather,
Yeah.
but we will have one or more.
Right.
That is the worst, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which brings us, circles all the way back to the emergency situation. Are there any other questions about this scope, phase 2 scope?
I think it's pretty comprehensive. I like what I'm hearing. I think time-wise, I mean, if we can expedite as much as possible, if we get approval. And, and I kind of like the idea that maybe we could look at some things that are almost like low-hanging fruit, that we could probably make recommendations on and get in place before the high season. So I'm good.
Okay, good. Blair? Okay, so if you could make those few additions and any enhancement you could make of this is
Okay.
great, the scope, then we can proceed with, first of all, we need to get in touch with Town of Mount Pleasant, make sure that they are aware of what's going on and fully on board with it. I think that's a good way to improve our relationship with them and show how we could be mutually beneficial in this study.
Madam Chair, I do have one other thing
Yeah.
I meant to bring up because we touched on it earlier,
Mhm.
and that's a hurricane evacuation plan.
Yes,
I guess that's all part of this, or is that separate that we're talking about as we do this study?
we were talking about it in the first phase, I believe.
Okay,
Um,
all right.
Is there signal timing for hurricane evacuation plans, or do you just turn them off and put them on flash?
Right,
Okay.
Mhm.
So I think the plan would come under phase 1.
okay.
Um,
We don't have a formalized hurricane evacuation plan at this point on the island. I thought we had,
We have an emergency operations plan
Right.
for the city. There are evacuation plans that are developed by SADOT, and that was one of the things that they had recommended to offer to us to give us some training on the new modifications on how to hurricane evacuations plan, but I don't think that has happened.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think somebody just needs to have thought about it if we change the configuration of the roads. And that's where that's coming from, I guess.
So it would really be probably in that phase one, more on impacts of whatever changes are done. What are the impacts on the hurricane evacuation
Yeah.
plan?
Okay.
And that it meets
Mhm.
the operational needs of the police department, emergency. Okay. So with these two, I think we've done the two scopes. With Jennifer's input coming back to us, do we want to propose that these be presented at the next city council meeting, or to wait a month and review the final drafts?
I mean, I think that time is of the essence, right? So I think we would get the revisions based on today's discussion back from Ms. Beal. I'll share them with everyone, and I don't anticipate there being any issue. I mean, I think that
Okay.
we want to make sure that we communicate to DOT finally what's our position on the scopes, so that they can go ahead and get started and not delay this any further.
Okay.
But this would, any recommendation you come up with would not come up before this month's Ways and Means, correct? Or would it? I mean, we've got that next week.
No, I think that part of the report that's given to city council at the February council meeting, this could be discussed and shared with
Okay.
with the full council, what the scopes look like, what the revisions were, what revisions were discussed, and report that we would be sending that back to DOT. I don't think it requires any specific motion or final recommendation
Okay.
on it, unless there's anything that we've missed that somebody else would like to look. So the council agenda would include the revised, my goal would be that the council agenda will include the revised scope, so that everybody can see it ahead of time and give some feedback to you all.
And I think with council, the phase one scope will be performed by SCDOT. We already have funding for Jennifer Beal to review that project and act as on our behalf with SCDOT. So there isn't any money that needs to be allocated for that. Is that correct?
Well, the city council approved an amount not to exceed $15,000 for these services.
Mhm.
With this new scope, I believe that number would have to be increased, because the amount of hours and time that would be spent in reviewing and providing feedback on the second scope will be more than what was originally anticipated. So that's something that the city can address through the budget process.
Okay, so it's the phase two scope that would require the additional hours and funds?
Correct.
Okay. So I guess we start with a proposal from Jennifer about how much additional funding might be needed. Assuming it'll be a longer duration, so you certainly will need more. Okay,
I mean, do we have an action we need to take on this today?
no,
So
we're
we
gonna,
just include it in the agenda for discussion at February's.
Correct.
Council
And
meeting.
what we'll do is, in the first draft of the budget that I'll present to council at the next Ways and Means meeting, will include, as part of operational expenses, will include an amount to cover the additional expense associated with the second phase.
okay, good. Now back to the other issue, that's third issue. I don't want to misstate, so do you
Do we
want
need
to?
to make a motion? That's right. Based on what we did in.
Yeah,
executive
yes, if you all want to take any action, then.
Right,
then
well,
so.
you're the one that, during executive session,
Oh.
that stated it clearly, so that I don't want to say something that's not part of what we already discussed.
Well, I think that there's some discussion about, which was brought up before the executive session, about hiring an expert that would look into the modifications to the connector and identify, if any, what violations were incurred with those modifications, and then also send a letter to SCDOT requesting the connector to be returned to the previous condition. while the city and DOT pursue working on this longer term study. Is that what you all want to discuss?
Well, we're looking for a motion, I guess. So
Yeah.
I would, I would move that we recommend to full council that a letter be sent to SCDOT based upon statute 820. That the city has not agreed to the changes to the connector and requests that the connector be returned to its original striping until such time as a agreed upon change to the connector can be reached.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Second motion is that we recommend to full council that an expert be hired to cost not more than $15,000 to identify all violations of South Carolina statutes, laws, SCDOT regulations, or generally accepted safety requirements on the connector as it is currently configured.
I'll second that.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The first motion, there was a vote? Yes. Oh, okay.
Okay. Any other issues for today?
None here, ma'am.
I want to thank everyone for your time. It's been a long meeting, but it's been very fruitful, I think. We have a plan to go forward.
Motion to adjourn.
All right.
Second.
Second, all in
Third.
favor?
Aye.
Thank you.